The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Good morning, good day, good evening, good afternoon, good people, good comrades, wherever you are in the world. This is the Pantsula Podcast presented to you by the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. We are a couple of members of the Kaji Circle. I am Jamilah, and I am here with Sadiq. And the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, in case you are not aware, has a very clear objective, and that is Pan-Africanism. What is Pan-Africanism, you ask? That is a unified socialist Africa. We practice scientific socialism. If you had any questions whatsoever, you can ask us here who do the podcast. You can go to the international website, A-APRP-INTL.org. There are plenty of ways you can ask that question. We have social media. There's lots of ways you can ask. Our one ask of you, though, and we will keep saying this every single episode, and we'll say it at the end: join an organization. That is our one ask of you. Now that we have that out of the way, we want to address a few things. I will say that today is the first day since the accident. If you look at past episodes, I talk about the accident that happened to me. I got hit by a semi-truck, if you didn't know. And it's the first day that I did laundry on my own. I walked down the stairs to do laundry, and I walked back up the stairs with a prosthetic. So that was very tiring, but I did it. So some people called them milestones to me. So, I'll use that, little milestones. I don't particularly make a big deal out of it. Like, oh, there is this thing, but I think the small things are the things that do count in situations like this. So I did want to announce that. I just wanted to say that. It's not like, I don't want everybody to be, but I think that anyone who is struggling in that way, to whatever level you can get over particular humps, I support you in doing that. And it can take one day, it can take 1 year, it can take 10 years. But this is very much like a revolutionary process. It's not going to take one day. It might not even take 1 year, but we will get there as we organize and we work towards the objectives that we want. So everything that I do, I try to compare or put in that field, looking at it as a revolutionary process, because sometimes it's like, well, I don't know, I'm not feeling like it today. But then when you're in the midst of it, like, okay, the ancestors went through this kind of stuff. I got hit by a truck, okay? The fact that I can go downstairs and do laundry, that's a thing. Again, it's just a thing to me. It's not necessarily a big thing, but it is a thing. And it is one step towards doing that work that the ancestors have set up for us to continue. So that's how I like to look at it, not as this individual, I did this thing and that's right. It has nothing to do with that. It's more about looking at my life and where I've been and where I hope to go. And so taking those steps just to do laundry is a part of that. It's not about the step itself, but it's about the journey in taking that step. So when people ask me how I feel, I don't know really how to answer that. I'm tired. But I think ultimately when I think about the objective, once again, that it is one step towards reaching the goal in this organizing work. And that's really what I want to do. So it's not like, yay, laundry, whatever, but it's one step towards getting to the world that we want to see. And that's what really makes me happy about all of this, even with all of the struggles, the physical struggles, the mental struggles. It's knowing that we are seeing the liberation of the masses of the people around the world, and we're moving one step closer to that every single day. And that's really what helps me look forward to getting up in the mornings, to be honest. So I just wanted to note that. I know that was my TED Talk right now, but I did want to note that it's one step towards not just doing laundry, but wiping ourselves clean of capitalism. The washing machine is going round and round and round and going, and that's the dance we're going to do when we see the end. So just think of laundry as washing away capitalism, and then you'll have a nice day. So yeah, I did want to say that. Maybe that's a bad comparison, but yeah.
That's a perfect one.
But right now, before we even talk about what we're going to talk about in this episode, we do love to honor the ancestors, as mentioned, because without them, there would be no us doing this work. So Sadiq, take it away.
Will do. Yeah, thank you. And also want to thank you for being an inspiration to us, and at least for me, you know, I won't speak for everyone else, but, you know, you dealing with everything you've been going through since the accident, and striving, and inspired me to, you know, strive more and do more too. So definitely thank you for that. So yeah, just like you stated, we honor our ancestors every episode. If you're an avid watcher, you've seen us do this several times. If not, then, you know, just as Jamilah stated, we always like to pay reverence to the people before us. So before we get started on each episode, first we like to pay reverence to Sophia Bazi. She was a revolutionary, member of the FLN. For those who don't know, that's the National Liberation Front of Algeria, who sought the complete emancipation of women and equality from women on all fronts. Because at that time, women were told, obviously, you know, during that time, during revolutionary movements, patriarchy was prevalent, as it still is, and women were typically regulated to household activities, domestic activities, and were told they're not allowed to fight on the front lines for liberation. So her and several other women are part of the FLN took it upon themselves to combat that and fight for women's liberation in that struggle. So we definitely commemorate this to her. And then also the second person we commemorate this episode to is Nde Nutumbaza. I may be butchering his name, forgive me for that, ancestor, apologize. But he was a member of the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon back in the 1950s, and also was a founder of the One Cameroon movement. Due to his political stances at the time during like British colonial rule, he was exiled from Cameroon in the 60s. He went and sought asylum in Ghana and Algeria. He then returned back to Cameroon in the 90s. He had close contacts with various revolutionary movements and leaders like Felix Maumi, Kwame Ture, Sekou Touré, Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, and others. They actually transitioned back in 2010. So yeah, just once again, just reiterating the point, thank them for their efforts, their struggles, and everything they've done and laid out for us to continue that work. So yeah, without further ado, this episode we're speaking about will be centered around Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism.
And Sadiq, you know what the commonalities are with the ancestors you've named?
No, I didn't.
Nationalism. They supported an African nationalist struggle.
Yeah.
That is the commonality. So we are going to discuss these distinct differences between Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism itself, which are very important distinctions.
Yeah, so I guess we could probably just start off giving a definition and maybe the differences between Black, quote unquote, nationalism and African nationalism, aka Pan-Africanism.
We want to address what people think of as nationalism. A lot of people look at all nationalisms as being one and the same. Lenin looks at nationalism as having particular common interests like language and other aspects of culture. For us, because Africans are all over the globe, there aren't similar languages we have. Some of us speak French, some of us speak other colonized language like English or Portuguese. So we're not going to have similar interests in that way. There are different cultural aspects. So some people practice Islam, some people practice Christianity, some people practice Ifa. However, that doesn't mean we should not have a common national struggle. So with Pan-Africanism, as we described in the beginning, It is a unified socialist Africa. Having a common struggle on that end is going to, obviously, if we're looking at Africa itself, it's going to include people that are not descendants of West Africa. For instance, we look at Libya, we look at Morocco, we look at different places around the world that do not share, again, quote unquote, racial similarities, but there is a common national interest. So we have to look at that and make those distinctions. And one thing I wanted to say, and I wanted to ask you, Sadiq, because there was a particular person we had on a couple of the episodes, and I just want to ask about the possible struggles that were had on the national issue, or just further conversation around it. So there was a quote, and in the 1950s, some countries in Black Africa took center stage in the struggle against colonialism. But within 10 years, that was fading, and Africa's role as a front runner was slipping into the background. But events were taking place in Cuba that catapulted Cuba, a country that is 70% Black, into the forefront of the African Revolution. In that role, Cuba's platform of world revolution resulted in assistance to several liberation movements within Africa that managed to turn the political status of those countries upside down. If Cuba had waited until the countries inside Africa were free, many of the liberation movements inside Africa would probably have failed. Cuba carried out a revolutionary agenda. Cuba liberated itself, and because Cuba had liberated itself, it was able to assist liberation movements inside Africa and move the African Revolution to a higher stage of accomplishment. Okay, right there is talking about the African liberation struggle. Cuba contributed to that. So to say that there is a Black nationalist struggle or a particular interest in a singular nationalist struggle, right here is proving that there is a common struggle around the world wherever Africans are, and Cuba contributed to that. So going on, it says a common enemy does not make a common struggle. So here's where the contradiction lies, if you ask me. Too many differences have been generated to allow the struggle of Black people throughout the world to act itself out as one concerted war for liberation. As far as the leaders of countries like Nigeria, the Central African Republic, and Senegal are concerned, they are already free. And I bet my last dollar that most of them don't care at all if the Black individuals in Barlovento are free or not. On the other hand, there are people suffering in Africa who probably don't know that Guyana exists. How are they going to coordinate their struggle with the struggle of the Black people in Guyana? How are the Black people in Guyana going to fire a shot against the abusers of Black people in Chad? That the two are inseparable is not a connection that a person capable of straight thinking would make unless that person is a romantic or suffers from excessive emotional responses to conditions that are best free of emotional involvement. The thing about this, and that was an end quote, the thing about that is people everywhere around the world knew about George Floyd. People around the world understand what the police do to African people in the diaspora. Because in some of those cases, the police do the same thing in Africa. So there are many connections. Again, there might not be a common language as opposed to individual languages, but there's a common language that we want freedom. And the key is to organize for that freedom. This is why there are different groups organizing. There's a African United Front. So again, there may be various ideologies in that African United Front, but there is a common struggle. So to say that people in Guyana, the struggles of people in Guyana are different than the struggles of people in Nigeria, like I just, in whatever study that I've done and talking to people in these various countries, the struggle is not that different. There are commonalities in the struggle. There are commonalities in our oppression because the African liberation struggle is global. So I would love to hear your response to that particular thing. We'll get into other things, but I do want to address this point because it really is about national interest when you look at it.
To kind of just hammer this home and speak on those who look at quote unquote Black nationalism as the complete goal, or that would completely bring about the emancipation of people of African descent all over. Nkrumah said, I guess kind of speaking to it from Nkrumah's viewpoint, Nkrumah says, I can't remember exactly what book, but he talks about how African people of African descent will reach limited objectives unless Africa is totally unified, politically unified and emancipated. So with that being said, this is not antagonistic to people who want to struggle, in the United States or anywhere else to be able to provide healthcare or provide services to the people. But this is to say that you can't be free here if your homeland is not free, essentially, especially a continent which is very vital to the world economy and the world's survival and advancement because of the mineral resources it has. With that being said, it's like, that's why as an A-APRP and as Nkrumah Ture, we understand in a dialectical manner, okay, nationalism is a necessity to reach our final objective of Pan-Africanism. But without that, and also, the land contradiction too. Granted, our relationship to the land isn't the same as like settlers here, European settlers, I should say. Our relationship to the land isn't the same, but we also still understand that we can't achieve full liberation if our motherland is still subjugated under neocolonialism, imperialism, and et cetera. That's a dialectical understanding that we have within the A-APRP. So I think anyone who is fighting for complete liberation of African people have to, yes, struggle from a national level, but the main objective should be Pan-Africanism, because once again, it is, and also too, I think we kind of have to get back to the basics. I know we've probably discussed this on, maybe one of our episodes, but some people think or have this notion that Pan-Africanism is solely just everyone repatriating back to the continent. No, once again, it's a total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. Now, would there be people who repatriate, maybe in large numbers? Yes, possibly, once Africa is liberated. But at the same time, that is not the goal. You going there and like opening up a business or something like that isn't Pan-Africanism. I'm sorry. Like, using your technical know-how and resources, yes, I guess that's useful in the struggle and the liberation, but you solely doing that or engaging in the capitalist system, thinking that you're gonna further like liberate us when capitalism is the reason why we're under this madness and they're subjugated and exploited, essentially, because you can't have capitalism without exploitation. We have to, get very scientific with our understanding of these things and look at these things in a dialectical manner. And, kind of just addressing those main points. It's like, can't be free if your homeland isn't free. And two, there's also that land contradiction too. And once again, we don't have that same relationship as the settlers, because, we were forced here, or Africans were forced here, for capitalist interests and imperialist interests. But we have to always look back to Africa, which will be to our well-being. And once again, looking at it dialectically, somebody goes, hey, what does Africa have to do with me? Why do I care? Like, so the laptop you're probably watching this on, or the phone you're watching this on, is powered by columbite tantalite, right? Which is a mineral source in Africa. I believe it's in the Congo, if I'm not mistaken. So if I'm incorrect, I believe it's in Congo, because Congo is probably one of the most minerally rich countries in the world. It's a vital part of, it's like the heartbeat of Africa, essentially. Think of like the copper, and think of magnesium, you think about the cocoa, you think about all these things, like all these things that we consume that we don't even think about is extracted out of Africa. So imagine if those resources are used to the benefit of Africans on the continent and abroad, right? And then also, even from the extent that Africans are being mistreated anywhere in the world, if Africa is politically unified and the masses rise up and take over power of Africa, and we have an all-African union and government, we could say, hey, this country, you're exploiting Africans and people of African descent. You're not going to have access to columbite tantalite. You're not going to have access to diamonds. You're not going to have access to ore. You're not going to have access to et cetera, which is very vital to a lot of people's economies to keep it running. You're not going to have access to oil. And you see how oil is affecting the world now and trade and stuff like that, with the whole thing going on in Russia and Ukraine. So you could imagine the deposits that's like in Nigeria and other parts of Africa and West Africa and Central Africa and so forth and so on, that if we shut that faucet off, countries will have to concede to our wishes and our wills because Africa has power and is unified.
Thank you. So you had a comrade that has been on a couple of times that organizes with the Republic of New Africa. And one thing they did discuss were the various ideologies within the organization. So one of the philosophies or theories or sentiments that are shared is that Black nationalism is going to save African people in the US. Have you had further discussion with that comrade in terms of where they stand on that? And has there been a struggle given the ideology we hold as incrumentarists?
Actually, yeah, I don't believe we had a struggle on that, but that is probably something we can bring them back on to discuss, or I can have a discussion with them on that. Yeah, as I stated, there's things we're probably going to dissect with that, like looking at it dialectically, like the term Black nationalism in itself. There's some pitfalls with that in relation to saying that that's going to free Africans here. And yeah, I think in a way, it's going to be kind of like when Nkrumah said, there's some objectives that we can meet that are maybe like small ones that we could achieve. Some of the community stuff that some people are doing now, maybe a little bit further than that, providing hospice care or whatever the case is, like some of the stuff we've seen the Black Panthers do, Black Liberation Army do, whatever, without tying it back to the continent and liberating the continent or putting some effort to do that, then yeah, it's not gonna, not saying that they're not doing that, because this, RNA is definitely a revolutionary org, and they've had relationships, as we noted in our episode, like with Mugabe and Zimbabwe and other African heads of states and, movements, revolutionary movements on the continent. But to solely look at it as quote unquote Black nationalism is going to liberate us is faulty, at least from Nkrumah's viewpoint, and it's in a way undialectical.
Yeah, and the 5-second or less argument to counter that is, this is not our land.
yeah. Everything is based off land.
Exactly. That is where the power is, which you explained quite succinctly. I want to add another quote from this same piece. It says, "The first huge obstacle to the Africa First position is the fact that no one can package or arrange revolution or struggles for liberation like you package a bar of candy or a birthday cake. You can't schedule a revolutionary agenda of developments or agree on a series of system-shaking events in advance. We're talking about unscriptable human processes generated by stressful conditions in multiple locations, each one unpredictable, sociopathic, complex, and compulsive. Forecasting a historically important release of revolutionary energy is nearly impossible, but orchestrating and coordinating events in several different countries brought about by the sudden release of revolutionary energy is, in my opinion, well beyond human capabilities." So it's clear that someone with this perspective would say the greatest level of freedom is Black nationalism for people in the US, for instance, because they clearly don't believe that people can organize in various parts of the world to create a common cause for African liberation. That is what it's saying to me. What say you, Sadiq?
Yeah, I think because that's kind of from a isolationist type of standpoint where you think things happen in silo, like everything, understand dialectics, you're going to hear me say that a million times. I say that throughout my day. Dialectics is my favorite word to use. My favorite.
I know concept. It is.
Yeah. But yeah, everything is interrelated, even when you talk about struggle. Like, Malcolm X said it, like, you can't talk about Mississippi if you don't talk about the Congo, right? Or like, if you don't understand the struggle that's going on in Congo, you won't understand the struggle that's going on in Mississippi, vice versa, because the struggles are intertwined, right? We're all Africans, we're dealing with the same. And then also too, like, there's people who are non-African dealing with similar struggles, right? And who's to say that they can't help us, or there's things that we can adopt in their struggles, and vice versa, to help gain our liberation. So to think, and then even also too, we live in a globalized world, a globalized economy and trade. And this has always been the case since like the beginning of man and mankind, or, just humankind, I should say. Let me say it, since humankind is around. If you look at the history of East Africa, places like Mozambique, they had trade with Eastern Africa. If you read like The World in Africa, or by W.B. Du Bois, or if you read The Black Mother, or AKA he reprinted it under The Transatlantic Slave Trade by Basil Davidson, he talks about this too. And there's other books too as well that talked about the commerce and trade that East Africa had with Asia, essentially Far East Asia and things of that nature, India, even China. And then you even had North Africans trading with West Africans, and North Africans trading with Europeans, and so forth and so on. So there's always been a trade and commerce going on. And we always lived in a globalized world, globalized economies and stuff like that. So to think that, oh, we just need our own nationhood, nothing else is related to that, nothing else can interfere with that, and this world and economy functions that way, is unrealistic, undialectical again, to think in that frame of fashion. You can't have revolutionary nationalism if you don't sync it up with, if it's not tied in with internationalism.
So here's another perspective that's, to me, similar to how people look at socialism or nationalism as being primarily European. So there are writers like Kwame Ture, who was at Kent State University, that described Pan-Africanism as being Eurocentric in one form or another. And this person advocated more for a Pan-African nationalism. So is there a difference to you between Pan-African nationalism and Eurocentric Pan-Africanism, or is that really a thing? Or again, is it how people describe socialism and saying that Kwame Nkrumah didn't understand the levels of socialism, even though Kwame Nkrumah on many occasions talked about socialism being socialism? It has to do for us with the conditions of African people. So we don't have the same conditions as European people, but it's still socialism because it has a particular national interest, it has a particular class interest. So to say that Pan-Africanism is, I'm quoting here, saying Eurocentric, dysfunctional, ahistorical, and divisive. So that is what some people think about Pan-Africanism, and they must separate that from Pan-African nationalism. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of ahistorical to say that in a way, because there's developments that happen, or universal aspects to humanity, or just like development that happens across, everywhere. We're all humans, we all people. So like we all develop, based off where we're at different levels, of different fashions. Because obviously when European invasion happened and the transatlantic slave trade happened, we were shifting into feudalism, or a more mature version of feudalism. Feudalism did exist before they came, but it was going in succession. And then by the time Europeans came to the continent, they already were shifting into capitalism, which is obviously succeeds feudalism. So me saying that essentially is going into tie into the point that the way people develop is going, Kwame Ture says this, and you even the brother Tokes Adewale, refers to this too as well, which is something I definitely agree with. If you just talk about Africa, you see the development. It went from tribe, nation, and we never got to continental unity. But as you can see it, from your tribe, nation, and then eventually continent. And that's what happened in Europe. They were able to do that, but our progress got impeded due to the European transatlantic slave trade, or Europeans invading and, imposing the slave trade, or whatever, right? Anywhere you look, that's just the development of humanity. People go from tribe, nation, and then continent. We just never, and if you even look at some of the empires that we had on the continent at that time, some of the empires and stuff like that, as you can see, like some of them were expanding across territory. And you can see that, one would, no one knows for certain, but, one would like to assume, given just human development, is that it would have eventually led to some form of continental unity as well. So yeah, so I don't think it's just like a European thing that you have some type of, identity based off continent and land. Is human or develop, something that happens over time, given development.
Yeah. This is gonna be a quote heavy episode, y'all. So just, there's actually a quote for somebody from the A-APRP, and this is regarding Amilcar Cabral, nationalism, etc. Consider, for example, our revolutionary objectives. They include nationalism, socialism, and Pan-Africanism. We have to look at how these concepts have changed over time and how they apply to our struggle today. How do we define nationalism today as compared to how we defined it in 1968? That's when the A-APRP was founded. Amilcar Cabral's definition contemplated controlling the means and modes of production. But we are currently in a complete state of neocolonialism, where even though the means and modes of production are in African hands, there are still foreign forces that give those African hands orders about what to do with those productive resources. That's what you mentioned earlier, Sadiq. It's very different from what existed in 1968. Consequently, we are looking at achieving liberation of the nation from neocolonialism. Conditions have changed in other ways. In the diaspora, for example, we see how in Brazil, Colombia, and other places, there are Africans fighting alongside indigenous people and to a certain degree, forging a different kind of nation. How are those struggles against settler colonialism tied to the African Revolution? Is settler colonialism in some ways upheld or aided by these struggles in which Africans seek land outside of Africa? We have to define today how these struggles fit into our definition of Pan-Africanism. In the Caribbean, none of those islands are self-sufficient in terms of production. They are very neo-colonial, even with national independence. It underscores yet again that our struggle is primarily against neo-colonialism. So this also speaks to the point that the person was speaking or writing about earlier when saying, well, these particular countries in Africa, they declare themselves free. So why would their interests be the same interests as someone in another African country or in the Caribbean or wherever? So this sort of explains it, that the common fight for so many of us is against neocolonialism. And we deserve to have these resources in our hands, ownership of the means of production. So that is what we're fighting for on a class level. We're also fighting for that on a national level. And in order to achieve that, we have to also address the contradiction of neocolonialism. So all of these things are connected. We achieve socialism when we deal with these things, but we have to do it in an organized way. So to say that the interests of people in Ghana are not the same as people in Guyana, like, I beg to differ, because they're, again, neocolonialism is everywhere. So there are common interests. There has to be common interests, because again, we're all over the globe. And even, again, using an example, the piece literally said that Africans are 70% of Cuba. So to say that there's no national interest in fighting for African liberation, I feel like the article itself contradicted itself because of that very thing. So there are commonalities. People understand that the root of so many of our struggles lays in the hands of whether or not Africa is liberated. So to fight on one end against colonialism, to fight an embargo given by the US and other forces, all those, Cuba's fighting its own struggles, but understands internationally where the struggles lie as well. So why would Cuba want to assist New Orleans in Katrina, for instance? Because understanding that there are people everywhere, the people's class are everywhere. We can't separate that. So either, again, 5 second argument, either you're for the people's class or not. So, where do those things lie? The overarching thing, yes, we are addressing nationalism, but we also understand that there is a class struggle in that. And we understand that the struggle is in fighting neocolonialism. So I don't particularly grasp why people would have this analysis, and that fighting for liberation in these particular ways are based in Eurocentrism. I just don't particularly understand that, especially when someone's saying they're fighting for liberation in a colonized nation. That really doesn't make sense to me. Like, unless indigenous people get that land back, you're going to be fighting from the grave to get liberation. You're not going to get it unless the land is totally free. And I wanted to jump to what's going on with the Supreme Court. I know people have heard about the conversations had around Roe versus Wade. So I'm not going to focus on that, but we are going to look at the history of the Supreme Court, because this is also tied to national and class interest. So this is a piece, again, we're doing a lot of quotes here on this episode, but this was in a publication called Democracy and Class Society. And so this book was produced in 2008, but it was resurfaced due to the recent news in regards to the Supreme Court. So it says, quote, "I give you, gentlemen, the Supreme Court of the United States, guardian of the dollar, defender of private property, enemy of spoliation, sheet anchor of the republic." So right there, it's telling you the purpose of the Supreme Court. The purpose of the Supreme Court is not to protect the people. So why are people surprised at what's going on? I have no idea. Please study the history of this country. Please, because once you do, then you won't have faith in this country. You won't think that somehow it can be repaired if you really sit and study it. This country is doing the job it is intended to do. There's no reparations. The only reparations is giving the land back to the indigenous people and getting neo-colonialism out of Africa. You want reparations? That's what we want. So anyway, to continue, it says, this was a toast to the Supreme Court given by a New York banker in 1895. The United States Supreme Court is, according to the US Constitution, the highest legal authority in the country. The court's power is absolute and untouchable. The Supreme Court is portrayed as detached from society, with the justices assuming impartiality, loyal to no one but the law. Is it conceivable that the most powerful court in the richest country in the world could hold sway above the society in which it was created? Can anyone imagine that the most powerful corporations and generals in the world would agree to submit to the whims of 9 people in interpreting the laws that they operate under? To ask the question is to answer it. In fact, every law and every document that defines the character of the US government and legal system have been created by those who represent a very specific sector of that society, namely the wealthy elite. In fact, it is a basic tenet of scientific socialism that the legal system of a society forms part of the state, the courts, police, prisons, and other institutions of coercion to resolve the inevitable class antagonisms in society that arise from exploitation. These institutions exist to maintain the rule of the dominant class, a tiny minority of society, against the interests of the vast majority. Under the most advanced form of capitalist rule, these laws and institutions are set up to make sure that the capitalists remain the highest authority of the land without actually appearing to be rulers. The democratic framework of capitalist democracy hides the anti-democratic system of wage slavery. And skip, we go on. We will post this article in the description. Hopefully y'all read the description because those are some links there and some sources. So it says racism has always been central to the growth of US capitalism and the ruling class's ability to rule. It is not surprising, given the predominance of slavery in the new United States, we call it United Snakes, that the Constitution would specifically address and endorse slavery. The infamous, quote, 3/5 compromise written into Article 1 counted the non-voting slaves as a fraction of a person when deciding how many representatives each state would have. In Article 1, Section 9, the Constitution banned states from limiting the slave trade for the first 20 years of the country's history. And the Fugitive Slave Clause, passed in 1793, forced states to return escaped slaves to bondage. This was the law of the land for nearly the first 100 years of US history, the law the Supreme Court was responsible for upholding. And here's where I really wanted to get to. In the 1857, no difference really, but We'll be scientific here. In the 1857 Dred Scott versus Sanford case, the Supreme Court issued its most clear ruling upholding slavery. Dred Scott was a slave suing for his freedom. The Supreme Court ruled that because Dred Scott was Black, and Black people were not people, but rather merchandise, he was not considered a citizen, and therefore he could not sue in any court for his freedom. The decision went further, requiring states that had prohibited or outlawed slavery to honor slave owners' rights to bring their property into that territory. In effect, by recognizing slave owners' property rights, slavery became the law of the land, despite the emerging divide between free states and slave states. The Dred Scott decision was part of the campaign by the slave-owning class to extend the power of slavery into non-slave states. This was the underlying political and legal struggle that eventually led to the Civil War in 1861, when the Southern states seceded from the Union and declared a new nation based on universal slavery. So you want to talk about national interest? There's your national interest right there.
Yeah.
So this is important. So people who think that somehow you can achieve or declare freedom in an area of the world that does not consider you human, whether it's police terrorism, whether it's the prison industrial complex, or whether people somehow harking back to the Three-Fifths Compromise. And I saw a picture recently, someone posted a picture, this was in Mississippi, that straight up had a sign, still to this day, in regards to these sundown laws. If you don't know anything about the sundown laws, please research that. This is when African people had to leave that particular area at a certain place and time, which was by sundown. So these signs still exist in this country. So to say that we can have a free African nation in a country where we are colonized, where we are not free, that just really does not make sense to me.
Yeah.
So you had Brown versus Board of Education, Plessy versus Ferguson, and now people want to talk about Roe v. Wade, where if you looked at those memos, they were like, yeah, I mean, it's not a thing that we wanted in the first place. You know, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but they were saying, you know, yeah, it's best to leave it up to the states. So the whole point is that even though they're considered the Supreme Court, they are far from principled. And they're just like, you know, whatever, we'll do the bare minimum to look like we're upholding some sort of rights for people. Whose interests do they serve? Not ours. So we need to understand where the loyalties lie to these people. We have to understand where the loyalties lie of the United States government. It is not for the masses of the people. So aiming to somehow repair what is not meant to be repaired because its very purpose is to serve the ruling class, we have to rethink that. Immediately, we have to rethink that. So I wanted to just read a little bit of that. We will put the piece in the description. Hopefully you read the pieces that we do put up there and you listen to several of the podcasts we put, but that comes later. But yeah, I really did want to remind folks that we are not free anywhere in any place in the United States. There's no way. As long as you are a wage slave, if you are a colonized person in this land, as long as indigenous people do not have this land, we're not free. And as mentioned repeatedly throughout this episode so far, no African in the world is going to be free unless Africa itself is free. And how do we do that? Organization.
Yeah, all efforts has to be towards liberating Africa. Yeah, and I think another thing I wanted to mention too was just the whole notion of Black nationalism, primarily the term Black, you know, and kind of putting the emphasis on that. And
Sadiq,
some of the...
Sadiq,
yeah.
Say it loud. Say it loud.
Yeah.
Say it loud.
Wait, you can't hear me?
Say it loud.
Say it loud? What? Say what loud?
I'm Black and I'm proud.
I was like, wait, she can't hear me? What's going on?
I heard you just fine. You didn't hear me. I said I'm black and I'm
black
proud.
and I'm proud. Yeah. I'm black and I'm proud. Yeah, because like I think even when you look at these racial terms, like quote unquote white or black, like I think even when you talk about historically where it stemmed from racializing people as a means to subjugate them. And, you know, even the term white, Eastern Europeans weren't looked at as white, or people who at first I think it was just non-Anglo-Saxon people. And obviously it extended to include other people who encompass Europe. But initially it was, okay, if you're not Anglo-Saxon or if you're not Western European, you're not considered quote unquote white. You've seen how that term has changed and manifested over time to where currently now it's like anyone that descends from Europe, particularly, you know, is considered white. And then even still, like, you know, you have Ireland who's still fighting, the Northern Ireland is still fighting for liberation. And they were for a long time. And it's even debatable now if they are considered quote unquote white, right? So
6 counties are still fighting for that land. Again, it all goes back to land.
It all goes back to land, exactly. So even with the term black, we see how flimsy and how like race science comes into it, because when we talk about black, it's like, all right, are we playing this by blood quantum? Like, okay, are we adhering to one drop rule, which is created by the enemy who told you that, like, oh, okay, one drop, because like, you know, and in terms of race, depending on where you're at, some people don't adhere to the one drop rule. So that's why land has to be primary in our analysis and understanding, because even when you look at like, you know, Pan-Africanism or African nationalism, the ones who are Nkrumah's Terrorists or, you know, or adhere to an ideology under that umbrella is we understand the continental unity. And by looking strictly at the term black, quote unquote, that wouldn't consider North Africans black based off phenotype, right? Because a lot of people like to do that. Oh, they're not black because of the phenotype. I mean, if you want to be realistic, there's some East Africans who have a different phenotype than West Africans. So if we're just going off a West African or Bantu phenotype, this whole thing is erroneous. It's very flimsy. It's, you know, it doesn't have a stern idea. It's ideological confusion at that point, because it's like, all right, then who's black? You know, or who's considered black, whatever. So I think we probably have to have a redefinition of that, or completely just do away with the term black in itself. That's why even within the A-APRP, we have a scientific understanding that we all Africans. We don't call each other just like, you know, because I'm pretty sure there's people who have North African ancestry in our organization, and some of them aren't all quote unquote black. You know, just wanted to talk about that and maybe some of your thoughts and some other pitfalls you may see with the term itself.
There's definitely, you know, organizations like Black Alliance for Peace, a very, very close sibling organization of ours. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not like, oh, we're so offended if you use black. We just understand that the roots of where we stand in terms of national interest, in terms of political interest, lie in Africa. So that is where our identity as Africans lie, and so we call ourselves Africans. But there are people in the continent of Africa who call themselves black. So I think there's different contexts to using black. And so people talk about the black radical tradition. So to me, utilizing the term black is in a different context than somebody be like, I'm Black American or Black nationalism. So while we do use the term African, and I identify as African, and as you do, I understand where people are coming from. But there's a very different conversation when you utilize black to the capitalist class. So I'm going to be a black Bill Gates, for instance, or I'm going to be a black this, or we can have a free black land in a colonized area of the world. So I think those are very, very, very different contexts. And that is the conversation we are having in regards to national interest. When people are looking at national interest, I want to again go to another quote. Speaking of Black Alliance for Peace, here is a piece that is written by Jamilah, and I'm only going to talk about part of it. He talked about Andrew Yang and support for Zionism. It says, in the liberal world, Trump is condemned for attempting to reject the results of the election and indicating he might not leave office at the end of his term. But as soon as Biden occupied the White House, one of his most foreign policy decisions was to give the U.S. imposed Haitian President Jovenel Moïse, who is no longer here, a green light to ignore the demands of the Haitian people at the end of his term in February, which he's not here anymore. So he no longer remains in office. The article was written when he was, but I think the point still stands. It says, in the liberal world, the United Snakes has backed very vicious right-wing dictators in the world since the Second World War, orchestrates coups, murders foreign leaders, attacks nations fighting for independence in places like Vietnam, trains torturers, brandishes nuclear bombs, has the longest held political prisoners on the planet, is number one in global arms sales, imprisons more people than any other nation in the world, has supported apartheid South Africa, and is supporting apartheid Israel while championing human rights. In the liberal world, the US can openly train, fund, and back opposition parties and even determine who the leader of a nation should be, Ukraine, but react with moral outrage when supposedly Russian-connected entities buy $100,000 worth of Facebook ads commenting on internal political subjects related to the 2016 election. In the liberal world, Democrats build on racist anti-China sentiments and the identification of China as a national threat, and then pretend they had nothing to do with the wave of anti-Asian racism and violence. In the liberal world, liberals are morally superior and defend Black life as long as those lives are not in Haiti, Libya, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, all of Africa, and in the jails and prisons of the United States. Which is to your point, Sadiq. I'm going to repeat this again. In the liberal world, liberals are morally superior and defend Black life as long as those lives are not in Haiti, Libya, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, all of Africa, and in the jails and prisons of the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, liberalism is a disease, to say the least. I mean, you see how people just like to frame, oh yeah, this elected official or whatever, like, you know, that's African or whatever the case is, it's gonna liberate us. And, you know, that never happens. It's never going to happen because it's all about class interests at the end of the day. You know, you have to always tighten land, class, gender, and see analysis. And trying to form an analysis on anything related to this. But yeah, I think the Ukraine thing is very interesting too when you talk about national interest and the coup that's happened since 2014. We see that how the U.S. intervened there as well, because post-coup, you've seen that, you know, the Russian languages were removed and out of the system. You know, we've seen establishment of a neo-Nazi regime who had political power, Azov, you know, things of that nature. So we see how the U.S. has altered that whole thing there.
Speaking of that, I did want to, again, quote. This is from Sputnik News because this is recent news. Talks about no love is lost between Latin America's left-wing governments and the US, which has waged economic warfare on them while supporting violent regime change efforts by opposition forces. Going back to Ukraine, right? But Washington recently attempted to woo Venezuela back into the fold with the aim of regaining access to its huge oil reserves amid sanctions on Russia. Joe Biden has barred Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela from a regional summit to be held in Los Angeles next month. Biden is set to speak at the 9th Summit of the Americas, held under the auspices of the Washington-based Organization of American States. Study them. But his Mexican counterpart has questioned how the event can live up to its name with 3 Latin American nations excluded. Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Brian A. Nichols, told Colombia's NTN 24 News that Socialist Cuba and its 2 left-wing regional allies would not be invited to the conference scheduled for June 6th to 10th. This is a key moment in our hemisphere, a moment when we are confronting many challenges to democracy, Nichols said in Spanish. The countries to mention Cuba, Nicaragua, the regime of Maduro, That's Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. Do not respect the democratic charter of the Americas, and therefore I do not expect their presence.
Wow.
Saying you do not expect their presence is very different than outright banning somebody.
Exactly.
Listen to the language.
Yeah. Yeah. You see, I guess in this whole discussion about like nationalism, you see that any country that fights for any form of like nationalism or any type of unity on a continental level, this is what, especially if it's looking to be an alternative to capitalism, in this case socialism, it's definitely going to meet some type of resistance from the United States and the imperialist world and powers.
Mm-hmm.
Every
and
time.
It's important to look towards where the AMLO government of Mexico is moving, because there was a vote to move towards nationalizing the lithium. So if Mexico was not part of North America, would Mexico be banned from this conference? That's a question to ask. The question is right. What do we look like being the only country in the Americas? That makes no sense. So it's very clear where the US's national interests are. And it's not with the people. So don't be surprised at what the Supreme Court is doing. Just study the history of this country. And I think the more people do that, it's going to be very uncomfortable. It's going to be, especially if you're an adult that had faith in this country pretty much your whole life. I didn't. At the age of 10, I knew this country was trash. So, but a lot of people don't. And especially if they are of European descent and they've had relative privilege. Yes, they may have been poor, but they didn't see a lot of the stuff the rest of us did. So maybe economically they did, but socially, politically, they didn't necessarily see that. Or I should specifically say they didn't have to see that. So then when Trump came in, that was a wake-up call for people. And for the rest of us, it was like, okay, this country been that way for the rest of us. Where have you been? So now it's very clear what is going on. And so it's going to be painful for people to look at Joe Biden or Bill Clinton or Obama, especially, any of these people they supported because they weren't Republicans or assumed to not be white supremacists or something, to actually enact white supremacist policies. I think when that bubble bursts, it's going to be painful. What's it said? Pain is a huge part of growth.
I like that line.
So, or as Frederick Douglass said, there's no progress without struggle. Exactly. So you have to experience some kind of struggle in order to move forward. And I think the issue is when people continue to live in this bubble that somehow America can get right. That is the most liberal thing. And not even talking about like politically liberal. That is the most liberal thing, because you are avoiding struggle. So if you want a society to change, why keep voting these people in? You're just going to keep bumping your head or injuring your knees or whatever. And you're going to keep doing it. And you're like, why do I keep doing that? It's like, because you keep voting the same people in whose policies affect Africa, whose policies affect the Caribbean, whose policies affect Asia. So stop voting according to the four walls of this country, which negatively affects people in this country directly anyway. But you also have to look at how this country affects international policy. This is the imperial core. So you cannot vote according to Roe v. Wade, just Roe v. Wade. You cannot be a single issue voter because your vote for these parties affect the globe. I know that hurts listening to that, but it's the truth. So when you have this country support Augusto Pinochet, when you have this country oust a democratically elected president, maybe people didn't necessarily like it, but people voted for them. So that happened in Ukraine. So you had what happened in Iran. And then they're like, okay, you have the Shah, great, So this country repeatedly supports non-democratic government. They oust actually democratically elected officials and put in the people they want. How is that democracy? So these are the people you're voting in, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. It's about time you do homework on this country, and it's going to be painful. But you know what? You're going to grow as a person. You're going to grow intellectually. You're going to grow ideologically, hopefully. And you're going to grow again as a person. What happens when you grow your teeth? What happens when you walk, when your bones aren't fully formed? It's not the greatest. I can tell you this as an amputee. Walking is not the greatest right now. But you know what? It's progress. And for me, it's progress to move towards the world that I want, as I said in the beginning of this episode. So you want to move towards the world that you want, you got to progress and have some pain. That's the way it is. That's science, man. That's science.
Yeah, that's so true. And it kind of just boils down to Secretary when he talked about, I think it was in Strategy and Tactics of the Revolution. It's like, you really just have two classes, really. You have the people's class and the anti-people's class. And this country is always on the side of the anti-people's class, right? Like, that's the class they go to shroud for, they go to bat for via their policies and stuff like that, because the people in power are part of the anti-people's class. It's funny because I know I mentioned it works there. I can't remember if I mentioned it during one of the podcasts that we did recently, but I was reading Nationalism. I've been reading it over the last few weeks, and one of the things that stuck with me in reading it was when Kwame Ture stated that the people who have political power, that is the ideology that's going to be prevalent throughout society, and who are in power is the bourgeoisie, and what ideology is prevalent is the bourgeois ideology, at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to understand that because of that, a lot of us are indoctrinated with these things, but also too, it's like that ideology comes with interest or supporting interests. So what interests are they going to support? The bourgeois. So I think everything is going to lead to there. So, and just like you stated, like all these policies that we enact is, that we sign off for and we vote these criminals into office is bourgeois stuff that are anti-people. So everything is against Africans creating unions or, forming some type of continental unity and solidarity, and us controlling our resources, us controlling our destiny and nationhood and self-determination. Everything that they enact is against that, because they're against the people who are for that. So we have to definitely see.
I wanna correct you on one thing. Who is we? Who's we?
That people vote for. Yeah, you're right. Ain't no we in this, because I definitely ain't voting for nothing in this country. Like, unless it's a revolutionary organization comes out, then I'll get to voting. Other than that, these criminals and stuff like that, you on the ballot, I ain't voting for nothing. So yeah.
I want to actually talk a little bit about this one thing before we get closer to the end, because when we talk about the people's class, people are like, what's that? When you're talking about committing class suicide, what is that? Does that mean I have to give up everything? And does that mean I have to leave the country? And again, Africa is primary to us. And to the point you made earlier regarding ethnicity or phenotypes or whatever, there's people who have the same phenotype as you or I. You've seen what we look like if you've seen some episodes. Yeah. So it's very clear what we look like. There are people who look like us who go into Africa who do not serve the people. So phenotype doesn't mean anything. Yeah. If you do not serve the people, if your interests are not in the people's class, you are not for the liberation of African people. You can physically be in a place, but your heart is not there. Your mind is not there. Your ideology is not there. So what I tell people is that, yeah, I was born and raised in this country, but ideologically, politically, I do not identify with this country. And there's lots of people who are like me, whether or not they identify as revolutionaries, whether or not they're in revolutionary organizations, but I can guarantee you, because the majority of people are not voting. So it's very clear that there is no identification, because people understand that what I'm voting for is not for my liberation. It's not going to get me a higher wage. It's definitely not going to get me out of being on back pay for mortgages. It's not getting me out of a situation that I need to get out of. So people understand that inherently. So your interest may not match where you physically are. Repatriation does not mean that Africa is going to get liberated. If we all repatriated and we're not organizing in a revolutionary organization, that doesn't mean anything. In terms of committing class suicide, Nkrumah talks about the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie and how petty bourgeoisie can commit class suicide. So in so many cases, in most cases, people who are in the wealth class, people who are bourgeoisie are not going to commit class suicide. It is not in their interest to, because they hold mad wealth. So that's one thing. But the petty bourgeoisie, so college students, maybe doctors, nurses, that kind of stuff, or university professors, etc. Those people could utilize their privilege in one way or another to fuel the revolutionary process. So maybe someone utilizes their medical skills to open a free hospital. So maybe someone who works in a particular industry says, okay, I can get you to have meetings in this facility after hours. Somebody who is an actor or a musician or whatever could funnel a whole ton of money for particular revolutionary events. We actually were talking about this earlier with comrades in another circle I'm in. So it's not like this whole, what do they call that, a dog whistle? I don't know. I forget what it's called, but people love to go to extreme. So if you hate capitalism so much, how come you have a job, kind of thing? And it's like, that's not how things work. We have jobs so we can meet our material needs because the society's not doing it for us. It's not like we want to get up every day and get our labor exploited. So that's a terrible argument. So people going, whoa, how come you're talking about class suicide? Are you expecting someone to just like give everything up and just live on a farm or somewhere in the forest? Yeah, if someone wants to do that, as long as they're contributing to a better society, that's great. But that's not what we're addressing, because there are people who have some amount of privilege that could utilize that for the revolution. Again, utilizing whatever money they have, skills they have to further the process. That is what we are addressing when we talk about class suicide. So I wanted to make that clear, because people love to be like, well, we don't have the police. There's going to be crime everywhere. There's going to be more crime. It's just like, things are transitory, people. Things are transitory. And if you were an organization, you would know that. If you were studying revolutionary processes, you would know things are transitory. Things just don't happen in a vacuum. So even capitalism was a transitory period. There was feudalism before that. There was slavery. I mean, there still is. But, there were different types of slavery. Now it's a little bit more concealed because people continue to say, we don't have slavery anymore. Okay.
It's wage slavery now. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And there's trafficking. There's other, there's all kinds of things going on.
Prison labor and all that.
Yeah, exactly. So to say there's no slavery, again, people don't study, or people don't know what's going on in the world because it still exists. But yeah, to say, well, if we don't have this, then we have this situation. Everything is transitory. Everything's dialectical. So yeah, someone who works in a particular class, which is a petty bourgeois, their interests could still serve the people's class. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. When we talk about the people's class and the anti-people's class, we describe the Supreme Court. Those are the actions. Anyone who supports, you could be working class and still not support the people's class, because your interests are not for making sure the people are liberated. So yeah, economic class is one thing, but the socio-political class, that's a whole other thing. And they definitely are connected. They are connected. But as you're saying, Sadiq, there is the people's class and the anti-people's class. And where do you stand on that? If you are just putting your body in an event being like, oh, I support Black Lives Matter, you have to ask yourself a question. How much do you support African lives just by your body being there? Or are you committing class suicide, and some of the wages you have, you're helping to fuel a revolutionary organization? Or if you do tech in some way, are you, because they throw laptops away all the time, are you taking those laptops and giving them to kids so they have revolutionary schools, that kind of stuff? Like, what are you doing? Are you just like, yeah, I support, I hate racism. Sure, a lot of people hate racism, but they're not anti-racist. There's a big difference. So what are you doing to fuel? If you are petit bourgeois, even if you are working class, what are you doing? And here's where I'm going to say join an organization. Okay. It's very, very important that we do so, because that's how we're going to get rid of this system of racism. And, once we have a world that we want, we have socialism, there could still be racism, because there's a lot of contradictions. If there's no political education process, if there's no study on a gender analysis, if there's not all that stuff, we're going to have a lot of these contradictions. So it's important to have a political education process to be the guide to everything we do in building an organization. So make no mistake about that. We can't just put our bodies and be like, I hate racism. Great, there should be women presidents or whatever. Like, that's not going to do anything. But what are we doing? How much of our time are we fueling towards the world that we want? So that is a question we all need to ask ourselves. My TED Talk's over right now.
Nah, yeah, that's true, man. It's like, what work are you doing consistently to help liberate African people? You can't dabble in between. It's like, oh, I'm not anti-people, but I'm also not for the people. Once you say you're not for the people, you're against the people. Like, that's pretty much it. There's really no middle ground when it comes to that.
5-second argument, maybe 10. You can't say you're anti-racist and vote for Joe Biden. There's no way.
Yeah.
No.
Exactly. It's impossible, because everything he breathes and does and enacts, for the most part, is against African people, or it's some form of racism. So,
So you can hate racism. That's great. I hate racism too. That's great. But to say you're anti-racist, that's a whole other story.
Yeah. Exactly.
So you have any final words for our episode?
Listen, join an organization, fighting for liberation. If you want to join the A-APRP, we definitely welcome and invite you to do so. Like going on our website, AAPRP-INCL.org. Yeah, we'd love to have you. If you align with some of the things we said on this podcast. If not, if you feel like, man, these people sound crazy, they sound backward, I don't agree with none of this stuff, hey, listen, I'm pretty sure there's an org out there for you that you could join that may align with some of your thoughts and principles that you adhere to. If not, then hey, listen, you're more than welcome to create your own organization as well. So, you don't need $1 billion. You don't need to be like, oh yeah, no, I have to run up the bag. I need 2 million before I can help my people. Like, there's plenty of orgs that I know personally that started with either no money or very little money, if at all, right? Definitely. And feel free to, me personally or anything like that, feel free to reach out if you want advice on, how to do so, or just reach out to the party if you need help. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be opposed to helping anyone out to build their organization. But the main emphasis is join an organization, fighting for liberation.
That's right. We absolutely have no opposition to that. If you are for the people's class, then we have no problem helping you with your organization. We can help you with some resources. Also, in terms of representing where you stand on the issue, we have the Forward Ever shop.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yes. African period. Oh, just there's several shirts and hoodies we have at the Forward Ever shop. The link will be in the description. There are also other podcasts we have for our comrades in the A-APRP and beyond. So there is the Forward Ever podcast. There is the Revolutionary African Women podcast. There is Our Ancestors' Voices. And there is the weekly Pan-African news, even though they are every other week, but there's still the weekly Pan-African News, because Pan-African News happens every single day. So you can hear a podcast episode of all of our comrades every single day. If you have it, there's so many things to choose from. So thank you so much for listening to our episode. Thank you, Sadiq, for sharing your wise words, your succinct words. And I just have to say, forward ever, backwards never.
Forward ever, y'all. Appreciate it.